Welcome to It's Not So Black and White, a podcast where we explore difficult topics with a desire to understand why we think and feel the way we do. I'm your host, Coach Jon McLernan, and each episode I bring you a guest who brings a challenging topic for us to shine a light on. This podcast is also broadcast live on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So on whatever platform you follow myself, Coach Jon McLernan, you have the opportunity to participate in this discussion during the live stream. We encourage your participation both by commenting and asking questions. This podcast is about exploring the human experience behind the ideas with compassion and critical thinking. So let's dive in.
All right, welcome back to It's Not So Black and White. Unfortunately, the regularly scheduled guest was not able to make the broadcast tonight. So this is a bonus episode where we're going to dig into the brain of Kyle. Maybe we'll dig into my brain too, I'm not sure. But we're going to try and solve
mutual digging.
Mutual digging, trying to solve all the world's problems. And we'll see what we come up with. So enjoy this bonus episode here. So Kyle, how about a little bit of backstory in terms of who you are and how you got to doing what you're doing?
I don't think I have a backstory. I never thought about it. I should explain my name though. So a long time ago, back when I think you probably don't even remember this because it wasn't that cool. But a friend and I had a parody website that was sort of like The Onion. It was a direct ripoff of The Onion. Direct ripoff. If we monetized it, we would have been sued out of existence. But we even copied sections and stuff. But it was
Nice.
called The Cow Tipper, and it was themed for like redneck Western whatever. I don't even know. Anyway, so
awesome.
we had different names and stuff, but that was so I go by Cow Tipper. That's my pseudonym now.
That's awesome.
That's the gist of that, and that's my whole backstory.
Right. Well, in real life, when you're not solving all the world's problems via podcast / live broadcast on social media, how do you occupy your time?
Man, that's a good question. I just live here. I don't know. I go to work and stuff. I'm an engineer. I work in manufacturing. I won't get too any more specific than that, but I live in Arizona, from Seattle originally, and I got tired of rain, so I moved to Arizona. And that's all. Like I tell people that, and they all laugh, and that is all. That's the reason I moved here. Legitimately, one day I got tired of rain.
Yeah,
and so I just moved.
Before we clicked record, we were having this conversation because we were waiting to see if our guest was going to show up, and it wasn't happening. So we're like, man, we should just click record and talk about this. The world, everything seems kind of broken, and everybody seems corrupt. The U.S. political system dominates a lot of people's, conversations and news feeds because it has such an oversized footprint. But I don't even know where to begin solving, because I think what we touched on was every facet of sort of this U.S. political system here is corrupt, and nobody really seems to have any particular stance, a really firm stance anymore. It's like, what do the people want to hear in our base, and we're just going to try and maybe put that message out there. And so, and yet hypocrisy runs rampant. And so, why don't we start with how you actually let's invoke the name of the guy that, invoke the name of the Voldemort of politics, Trump there, and why you thought
which one? You're gonna have to narrow it down.
Oh yeah, that's true. But how he actually got to power, because you said you felt like he didn't really actually have a platform, and that's the reason he ended up in the position he did.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think he had one, and I don't think he needed one. I think he branded himself really well early on. I mean, if you look at Trump's career, he's never really produced anything. He's always just branded himself and sold his brand. And it's Trump in big letters. It's gold. It's glitz. It's I'm a billionaire, or maybe I'm a millionaire. I don't know. I sell really good steaks. I have nice hotels. That nobody can tell you what he does. If anybody asks you what Bill Gates does, they'll say something about Microsoft, even if they don't know exactly where he stands. If somebody asks you what Trump has produced, I don't think anybody could tell you, because I don't think he's produced anything. He was a TV show star, ultimately. But he's branded himself well, and he's very good at it. He's very good at connecting with people, and he's good at sort of developing a following, I guess, which sounds circular, because of course all politicians want to, but he's figured out a way to do it without ever taking really a stance on anything. He just yelled a lot of stuff, and you and I were talking before. You said something about whatever state he was in, he just kind of he pinpointed whatever their issues were. I think that's true. He in going into his first term, I don't I don't think he had a platform. And as I was mentioning earlier, going into his second attempt at presidency, the Republican Party didn't have a platform at all. They didn't have one. It didn't exist. The platform was a literal copy and paste from the previous 4 years, because it actually had Obama's name in it. It didn't have any platform. There was no point to it, because they didn't need one. They knew that people weren't voting for Trump for any principled reason. It was more, this guy he's the best cheerleader. I think he had,
Right.
and I'm saying that, by the way, to my eternal shame, I voted for him the first time. Because I really thought Hillary was extremely corrupt, and I didn't want sort of the oligarchy that was building, which was the Clintons. I didn't like that. I regret that intensely now. I would have voted for anybody, probably a third party, just so I don't have to attach my name to either one of them.
Right. Would you, I mean, okay, so here's obviously hindsight being 2020 and all of that.
Yeah.
Looking back, would you have voted for, or would you, I shouldn't say voted for, I don't want to pin you down that way, but would you rather have seen Hillary Clinton come to office than Donald Trump come to office?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, because we may have had different problems, right? It's hindsight's really tough, because he did, to his credit, he just treaded water for the first few years and things went okay. We didn't really have any problems. When COVID started and when actual problems came up, he didn't know how to handle them, didn't handle them, made them significantly worse in my mind. I don't know that Hillary would have done that. It's hard for me to judge what somebody else would have hypothetically done. So
fair enough.
I'm still not a fan of Hillary. I think she was too connected. But I would like to run that scenario out.
You might actually get a chance to do that.
Yeah, help us all. Yeah, she might. I mean, that could happen again. We could have Hillary and Trump again running next time. I mean, because we're an absolute, we are idiocracy at this point. Like, there's no point.
Right. What, like, so here's what sort of, like, as an outside observer, because I'm Canadian and I still don't even understand a lot of the U.S. sort of political system. To me, it's like this big machine.
We don't either. Okay.
Yeah. It's really confusing. And I think it was maybe set up with maybe some good intentions, right? I think the idea, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand it right, it was to try to link up like three sort of different forms of government in one. So like power couldn't become too centralized,
right?
Where you have the common people's representation, the rich people's, or the aristocracy's representation, and then something sort of equivalent to monarch with limited power. Is that kind of how they tried to set up the original sort of U.S. republic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not great on U.S. history, but I really want to be. I've gotten really interested, especially with the way I've noticed that a lot of politicians invoke. We love our celebrity founding fathers here, and we love to invoke them, and no one can tell you what they actually said. And that's one of my kind of projects. I've got something going on over the next month, and I was just telling my wife the other day, I want to actually learn. I want to read up on these guys and kind of learn about them, because I think they're really misunderstood by people who claim them now. I think we invoke the founding fathers a lot in the founding of our country to sort of justify what we're already doing. And I don't know that that's fair, number one. And I also think it's inaccurate a lot of the time. I think you're right about how the government was set up. I think it was meant to be kind of a circular firing squad a little bit, so that you would get some agreement to keep from everybody shooting. Right. And I think that was done on purpose. And I think they wanted to keep, I think a lot of them, well, first of all, they all disagreed with each other too.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it took a long time for those guys to ratify, the Constitution. I think the Constitution of the U.S. is one of the greatest documents ever written. I really do. I think it's maybe the greatest document, as far as like non-religious text or anything, but like political document. It's the sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the distillation of the Enlightenment, essentially. It's a government that says the individual has value more than the state does.
Right.
And that was revolutionary at the time. And other countries have used that document since. And I don't mean to say like, yeah, USA number one, we're the first. It's just those guys thought of something that hadn't really been tried before, because nobody trusted it. There's the famous phrase that I want to say, one of them, I can't remember who said it. It wasn't Jefferson. It was, everybody says Jefferson says everything, but or Lincoln. But somebody said, what kind of government do we have? And the founding father guy said, a republic if you can handle it, or if you can keep it, something like that. It's kind of a famous quote, meaning they knew right ahead. They knew in advance, this might not work.
Right.
There might be a problem here, and we're going to have to keep churning this up and redoing it, which is why the whole thing, I mean, our Bill of Rights has all kinds of amendments on it too, right? We keep,
right.
you know.
So speaking of amendments, do you know, this is maybe a trivia thing because I have no idea, but do you know how many amendments there are to the original constitutional document?
I can't remember off the top of my head. No, this is something every American should know. And I bet every immigrant does know it because we make them, but nobody who went to our school system has any clue.
Well, if anybody who's watching knows, drop it in the comments. You know, I'm gonna go with 37 just off the top of my head.
I don't think there's that many.
But hey, we might be surprised. There could be like 2.
I'm gonna look it up.
So because the ones that get the most attention, like what was the First Amendment then? Do you know that one was?
So I mean, the First Amendment is essentially 27.
Okay, so hey, I had the 7 part right. Okay.
So the First Amendment, and I believe they're written in order. Again, I'm not up on my history, and I want to learn this stuff. But you know, the First Amendment is freedom of speech. Essentially, that's the sort of the distillation that everybody uses. It's essentially free association in groups and free redress against the government. So you can speak out against the government, and you can't be imprisoned for it. That's sort of, again, that's the whole. The individual has more value than the state. Kind of the sort of reformation of how people were viewing humanity at the time. It was a very, and of course the irony is that we had slaves. So it's like, we didn't exactly nail that, right? Like,
so there's 2 things I want to explore your thought process in this, because I really like how you think. Number 1 being freedom of speech and maybe how it's being bastardized, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The intent, or maybe it's like the intent behind it is being twisted to suit political aims instead of for. So what do you see with regards to freedom of speech and how it's being wielded today to try to accomplish, I guess, political aims? And, if it's not being used in the sense it was originally intended, according to your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, according to my understanding of the freedom of speech, it was simply just so that you were allowed to meet up in groups without government getting in your way. So that means religious groups, that means community groups. It was very broad. I mean, we fomented the Ku Klux Klan for a long time, right?
I was going to say,
there were members of our government who were, there were members of our government who were in the Klan as recently as like the 70s or 80s. So that's a problem, but it's not illegal, right? And then the other half of that is, besides the freedom of association, the freedom to speak out against the government, which is nothing is more Americana than speaking out against the government and not going to jail for it.
Right.
Which I think is good, by the way. I think that's incredible. And I think it would be a real problem if we lost that. I think that would be
right.
I think you can see what happens to countries that don't have that. And a lot don't, and it's really funny because it's a right that we take very seriously and we're very proud of, to the point that I've actually heard people in other countries mention First Amendment as if it means something at like a global level. And it's like, no, it doesn't. You guys have to ratify it, or you'll see what happens like in Russia with all these guys, walking out, holding up blank signs and going right to jail.
Right. So then because I think we see a lot on maybe probably more on the political right than the left crying about the infringement on free speech or the, free speech being removed.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's a misrepresentation because, I agree. I don't think anyone's going to arrest you for any political association you have or personal association or religious association. But I don't think it's necessarily the freedom to say whatever you want, carte blanche.
Yeah. And I don't really have a good understanding of like the legal theory behind sort of the court cases have sort of established free speech over time. What I do know is everyone thinks they can just say anything all the time with no repercussions, which is wrong.
Right.
And what you've seen a lot on the right, and what has actually led, ironically, to Elon Musk buying Twitter, is that social media companies that get really big start policing what's on them. And YouTube has shut down. They've gone through and shut down all kinds of conspiracy channels. Twitter famously kicked Trump off for life, which, by the way, that's the most American thing you could possibly do, in my opinion. It's a private company kicking the government out forever, right? Like that is our founding fathers, and yet because he's on the right, the people on the right called it like what are they, censorship. Everybody talks censorship. One of my favorite pictures from the last few years is one of our esteemed legislators, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I
believe that's being said tongue in cheek.
Absolutely, she's out of her mind. She went to the House floor. She's a representative from, I can't remember which state, Kentucky. I can't remember.
Atlanta.
No, it wasn't Georgia.
Or Georgia. Sorry, Atlanta's a city.
Yeah.
Gee whiz, I'm really
I
educated.
can't even
Canadian
remember
here.
where she's from, and it doesn't matter because I avoid that part of the country. But she wore a mask, because they were all against masks, or not all, but like a lot of right-wing people were very much against fighting COVID at all because of Trump. She went on the House floor and gave a speech with a mask on that said censored. And I thought that is the most American thing you could possibly do currently, is get elected to government, have one of the most powerful seats in the country, speak on live TV, and complain about being censored. That's America now. That's not what the founding fathers intended, but that's America's sort of conversation now, is constantly complaining that because people don't endorse them, that therefore censoring them. And I just have no time for that. I think it happens on both sides of the aisle, and I think it's really stupid.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the First Amendment. So then
it's a good one.
The Second Amendment is there to apparently protect the First Amendment, but again, probably very often gets misconstrued.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think I've changed my mind a lot on this one, but it's mostly I've just loosened up what I think. I used to be sort of a Second Amendment absolutist. I think everybody should have whatever they want, gun-wise. We don't. So I don't know the verbiage in the amendment, but we are allowed to bear arms and have a well-armed militia. That's another phrase I believe in the Constitution. Nobody knows what that means. I believe the founding fathers actually had a different definition of militia than we have. I mean, back then, when the country was, 100 miles wide and the Atlantic coast long, like the idea of protecting yourself with a musket made a lot of sense, right?
Right, because you don't know the rest of this landmass could be a lot of hostile forces in a sense.
Yeah, you were more worried about, if you weren't armed, you were way worse off, right? They didn't have 911, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
You don't just call the government to come help you. We have a much more powerful government and a much more omnipresent government now, and I think we're the only country in the world with more guns than people, by a significant margin.
Right.
And I think so. First of all, we have the freedom to have it, but if you've committed a felony, there's certain things that can sort of disallow you from having it, and we don't seem to care about those at all. If you're an absolutist, you're going to want felons to have them, as some people do. But like, if you're being ideologically consistent, you're going to say, hey, everyone should have them. Why shouldn't a felon have them? Just because he got some felony, how is that? What does that have to do with right now, right? But we never really talk about that. I don't know how I feel about that, honestly. I think everybody should be able to defend themselves, but
I mean, maybe the stance I would take is like, because what if your felony was like white collar crime?
Right. Like, exactly. That's exactly it.
Versus, but if your felony was connected to violent crime, then maybe we would put some restrictions around that. But then, like, I'm inclined to think that if you've already committed violent crime, there's a good chance you can acquire weapons anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. And we could talk all day about the merits of letting people have firearms, but it's a pointless conversation because A, there's just too many guns. And B, a lot of people rightly point out, and I point this out too, that a lot of the mass shootings we have in this country, places where guns are a problem, where you have a lot of crime, happen in two areas. One, places where guns are illegal, like in schools. Every time we have a mass shooting, it's at a school, almost always, right? And two, when they're not in public areas, when they're just street crime, typically it's in areas where I'm really painting with a broad brush, and this isn't actually accurate, but it's the perception anyway. It's that where the gun laws are the most strict anyway, right? Now that's not actually true. If you look at per capita, it's actually much more even than that. But the point is, like, what are you going to do? Disarm 350 million people? You're not going to do it. So I don't have an answer. I don't. I mean, the right wing says arm the teachers, and the left wing says take everybody's guns away. Neither of those is feasible or responsible. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. It's funny that we're taking the Constitution of the country that I said is the greatest document and finding all the problems with it. That's
but I think
nothing's more American than that.
But that's why the door was open for there to have been amendments where we go, okay, this is an issue. So then thinking about, like, I think America is the home to more conspiracy theories than anywhere else on Earth.
Yeah. I
So
hope there's not any place with more.
yeah. How do we, how do you, from your perspective, how do you see that we got to this place where there's so many? Because I mean, I have my own thoughts on why I think wild conspiracy theories abound. I'm a, we were talking earlier. I'm a cynic at my heart that wants to be an optimist, but I still feel very cynical. But I think a lot of what we would call conspiracies is actually just corruption in plain sight that's so boring that it doesn't grab our attention. But how do we get to the place?
Yeah,
That
I mean,
we're,
I think those are two different things. I think that corruption is a thing for sure, and it's omnipresent and sort of it's hard to even wrap your mind around, which is why the conspiracies A, oversimplify the problems always, and B, misattribute them into things that we think we can act on. So, there's no conspiracy theory that about how Nancy Pelosi got her money.
right.
Like,
okay.
we just know it. We just know it and we can't deal with it. So the conspiracy theory is that there's some evil person behind, the scenes pulling the strings, making her rich, right?
Right.
It's like not really actionable, but it sounds cool.
Right.
And we like sci-fi. So, I mean, conspiracy theories, that's been my jam for the last probably 2 or 3 years, because since COVID started, because I realized early on that COVID was such a big problem and so difficult to get our hands around, and not similar to something we knew.
Mm-hmm.
We were anchoring it at bad ideas, like, oh, it's kind of like the flu. Oh, it's like, maybe it's like Ebola. Like, we kept trying to pinpoint, like, oh, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. We didn't know what it was like, and we still don't, and we're really struggling with it. And in times of a lot of uncertainty and also sort of a present danger, there's a lot of different ways people react. Some people crack a book and think, how am I going to, academic my way out of this, and maybe never act. Some people just go crazy and move off in the woods or whatever. But a lot of people just created their own stories. And I think on the very first podcast you did on here with the three of us, I mentioned something about masks, where I said that it's hard to have a conversation about masks because the people who are against them aren't against masks, they're against what they stand for. And I think that's part of the problem. Is the conspiracy theory is to take something real, a very real concern. All of them come from real concerns, 100%. Yeah. But it maims them to the point that you can't do anything with them. And I don't know what to do with, but I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated with the fact that, like, there's the term, the rabbit hole, like going down the rabbit hole, the sort of Alice in Wonderland, follow the white rabbit kind of thing. It's like there is a weird path that people go on, and when your extremism expert comes on, I think there's going to be some parallels where you take one step down the path and you take another step and you start following the white rabbit a little bit, and you end up believing a whole bunch of nonsense altogether. You may have started out with a very real problem, but the worldview you have after you've spent a lot of time just mainlining YouTube is not accurate. And that's really, it's very, very hard to talk to people who've been down that path, because they're not attached to reality at all anymore. What's correct verifiably isn't important anymore.
I wonder if people are drawn to conspiracy theories for a couple of different reasons. One of them being, it gives you a sense of, like, knowing some kind of secret knowledge.
Yes. Yeah,
and then
definitely.
if it feels like you have some sort of power and control because you're being faced with something that is leaving you feeling powerless and out of control. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, one of the common things, I have friends on social media who went pretty far down the QAnon pathway without realizing they were doing it. I've watched and listened to way too much QAnon related content over the last few years because it's absolutely fascinating to me. And one of the really common threads is the people that go down those pathways are so proud of themselves for doing it. And they tell people, eventually you're going to wake up. They refer to it as wake up, right? So the left a few years ago had woke. The right now has wake up, sheeple.
Like awake, not woke kind of thing.
It's the same thing, right? On some level. I mean, I think it's a little more nefarious on the right, but that's personal opinion. But like, I saw so many people, even people I know, posting on social media, like, you know what? Someday you're going to realize I'm right, and you'll come back to me, and you'll apologize to me, and I'll be cool with you. I'll be fine. Like you can come back. We'll be friends. Like they already won this magical battle that's in their head over something that's not even real, but they really want to be right. And I think I'm way out of my league psychoanalyzing, but I feel like there might be something where it's like we all feel a little bit out of control, and we just grab.
Yeah.
You know, when you're sinking in the ocean, you just grab whatever's floating, right?
Right.
And if the thing that's floating is a stupid YouTube video about Plandemic, then you're going to buy it. I don't know. That's being too prescriptive probably for my expertise, but
sure. But I think that's why we're, with the world of free speech, I think we are allowed to have these conversations where we kind of just explore our thoughts, right? I don't believe that someone's going to come at you and say, I heard you say this on this podcast episode, and we're going to somehow use this to condemn you for having this opinion on it. I think you've qualified your thoughts around it fairly consciously, or conscientiously, I should say. There's a lot of like wild sort of conspiracy theories floating around. What's kind of currently on the radar of people that's because I don't feel like I have my finger on the pulse of like a lot of what's happening, because I should be more informed, but I find the news cycle kind of frustrating. And I'm
for one thing, I wouldn't pay attention to the news at all in that regard, because I don't think they do a good enough service to, and this sounds really like high and mighty, like, yeah, I got better sources. That's somewhat true, but if you go to the look, if you look for people who've been studying sort of extremism and cultiness and stuff like that, you'll find some threads, but they may not always necessarily lead back to the same place. At some point, those threads all kind of split off, and people just end up in a lot of different places.
Yeah. And looks like you're able to join us, which is great. We're right in the heart of talking about conspiracy theories and how people get to this place where they hold these sorts of beliefs. I'm not sure if your mic is on, if you're hearing us yet, but
I don't know.
Hey, there we go.
Is the camera on now? No, it's not.
You're a circle that makes sounds when you speak.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
Certainly can. Yeah, this is really cool to have you join. Okay,
so what's up?
Well, we got talking about conspiracy theorists and like kind of how people got there, and I'm Canadian, for the record, and I don't have, the U.S. sort of fascinates me in terms of what comes out of the U.S. I feel like I'm watching a sort of wild, out of control cousin that's like 6'10" and 400 pounds or something. And
Pretty much.
Yeah. And we're like this little cousin up to the north being like, what the heck is happening down there? How did these people get here? And I'm fascinated by your perspective, because you've had the opportunity to really get in the room with people holding very, very diverse and extreme views, and to really look at them through the lens of compassion and go, how did you get here? Not to endorse their views, but to understand the humanity behind the individual and how they got there.
Oh, that's so nice to hear, Jonathan. And that's exactly the stance that we take with everybody, with ISIS, with white supremacists. Where did you start from? Because I don't believe anyone's born a terrorist or born an extremist. It's, the circumstances they were born into and how they were raised. And the thing that we really noticed, and we do have Canadians in our sample, by the way, I think we have
I believe it.
4 or 5 Canadians, I'm not sure. A couple of Proud Boys, a couple of skinheads. I don't remember. I think it might be 5 of them out of the total of 50 so far. But what I was really amazed after doing 273 ISIS interviews, and I've talked to 800 terrorists, is that with white supremacists, I learned not to ask them as though I assumed that their parents were married, because so many of them, their parents never even married. And they're from these chaotic, abusive pasts. And, who cares what kind of family constitution you have? If it's loving, that's beautiful. But these were not loving homes. These were homes with alcohol and drugs and abuse, sexual abuse. Or else they were in schools where they were getting bullied. And So they went looking for protection or looking for belonging or looking for significance with white supremacists.
Right.
And, you know, we see the same thing with QAnon. We see QAnon playing upon this whole thing about, you know, we have to save the kids that are being sexually, the victims of sexual predators. And that plays to you if you have been a victim, because a lot of people keep that inside. They never talk about it. It's a big secret. But then
Right.
that can motivate them very quickly into action if they think they can protect another child from that horrible possibility.
So they're really holding a very, might I say, I don't know if it's like from their perspective, a very righteous perspective. And so there's actually, in their eyes, a justification for adopting the stance that they hold.
Yeah, and we just put out a paper, and I believe the first paper is already on our website. So if you go on ICSVE website and look at our brief reports or our research report, sorry, I don't remember exactly where it is, but it's also published in Homeland Security Today. We wrote a paper called Directed Hate, and we came up with 3 things that in our sample, and it's only 50, and it's not a random sample, so it's got problems, but you know, it's better than nothing. And they were in-depth research interviews, 2 hours each, with each of these people, asking them where they came from, you know, how they got into this. We found that the majority of people, I think it was 42%, joined because they were seeking a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of significance. They weren't joining because they were haters, but they learned to become haters. And we call this directed hate. That first you join, and the group tells you, oh, you can join us because you're white and you're special. And first they confer upon them the sense of belonging and purpose and significance. And then they tell them, we're under threat. You know, there's white genocide, white replacement is happening, and the minorities are going to replace us. But it's this grand design. It's the Jews that are organizing this, and slowly, they move them into, you must agree with us for our hateful and violent actions towards minorities and towards Jewish people. And if you're not willing to be on board for that, well, then you can't be part of this group. And the need for belonging is so strong that they shift into hate.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, and you answered that question, really. It's just this desire for belonging overpowers their maybe reticence to move into sort of adopting a violent worldview. One of the things I'm really curious about is how open are these people to being interviewed by you, and are they aware that you're conducting this research for these purposes, that you're not necessarily in agreement with their views but looking to understand them? You know, what is it like when you go and get into the room with these people?
Well, all of the white supremacist interviews I've done over Zoom, which has been kind of funky because I never did my interviews by Zoom before. But, you know, Zoom is so intimate. Look how, you know, I mean, you see me in my home right now.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, it feels like we're together, which tells you the power of the internet to use for recruiting. Because if you can, I mean, my theory of terrorism and violent extremism is there's four things that come together. There's a group, there's an ideology, there's social support, and then there's whatever is inside of you that's vulnerable. And if you're, if you know, 10 people join you and come and join you over the internet and tell you this is right, this is the right thing, and you belong to us, that's really powerful. And especially if it's as intimate as right now, that we're talking to each other and, you know, we're hearing each other's vocal tones, we're seeing each other, and we're thinking, you know, we could be in the same room, but we're actually in different countries. And that becomes very, very powerful. So, of course, when I do a research interview, I explain who I am, what our center is. I don't say, you know, we have these values. I don't explain our values, but I just say, you know, I'm trying to understand how people get into this. what your pathways were in, and if you're getting out of it, what your pathways out were, and what your experiences were in the group. And people really open up, because I think when they're interviewed by somebody, especially a psychologist, that is non-judgmental and just listens to them and helps them to put together the different parts of their life. I mean, we're all have an inner narcissist that we want to be understood, and we want to understand ourselves also. So if somebody's willing to spend 2 hours and say, what makes you tick?
Right.
Why would you go into this? They get invested as I am to try to figure themselves out. And they actually thank me at the end of the interview and say, this was very helpful to me.
Well, I think I was going to pay you a compliment. Like, you seem like a very non-threatening figure, a very caring, warm, compassionate, and really so safe to be vulnerable around. And I think that's a really key feature in getting people to open up and express openly, maybe views that might even be considered all the way down to the category of heinous, but because they feel safe saying it, that it's safe in your presence, really.
I hope so. And that is always my aim, to create a safety and an acceptance. And I mean, I believe in the power of love. I mean, maybe that sounds really corny, but I really believe in love. And, if you listen to people and you're willing to empathize with them, and I just suspend all judgment and try to get in their heads and think, okay, if I was you, how would I feel? And what would I do? And
Right. Yeah.
when I get into, if I suspend myself and just try to be them and feel them, it's really easy to guess what the next move is and say, oh, was that because of this, or was that because of this? And they're like, sometimes they'll say, no, that wasn't it at all. And I don't mind being corrected. I don't need to be right. And, it's a discovery process together to figure out what was motivating them and what they were getting out of it. Because that's always my question. What were you getting out of it? Because nobody joins anything. I mean, you don't join the Boy Scouts, you don't join the Girl Scouts, you don't join your neighborhood bowling league, and you don't join your, white supremacist or terrorist group, except that you think that you're going to get your needs met. And what made you believe that? And what did you think it was going to be? Because like with ISIS, people told me, I thought it was going to be this grand and glorious caliphate. I thought it was going to be so righteous and so beautiful. And it's so sad. They just threw their lives away and went to Syria. And, white supremacism is not a whole lot different.
Yeah, so that sort of answers the question I was thinking of as you were talking there about, when we talk about these people, we say, oh, they're a member of white supremacists, they're jihadis, they're whatever. We talk about them sort of with group titles, but you're talking to them on a very individual level. Do you find if you were to ask somebody under the group banner, why are you part of this group? They would tell you one thing, but on an individual level, do they mirror that, or do you find that the people, when you get one-on-one, do you find that they have kind of their own viewpoint on things, if that makes any sense?
Well, I'm trying to get into their head and follow them over time. So at some point, they didn't know any more about the group than I do.
Right.
At this point, they know a lot more about the group than I do, unless I happen to be an expert in that group. And, when you make 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 interviews of a group, then you start to know that group. So like KKK, I understand now. NSM, I understand. But still, they understand it way better than me. So I try to get into their head and follow them over time and say, well, when did you first hear about this group? How did you hear about them? Did you hear about them over the internet, or was it face-to-face? What drew you in? And it's so fascinating to hear what drew them in. And then, like, what was the picture forming in their mind of what it was going to be? And, a lot of them say, it was really wonderful. I mean, I was just I'm writing a book now on some of these white supremacist interviews, and one of the guys joined KKK, and he was going to do a synagogue shooting. He got arrested and ended up in prison because the FBI organized a sting operation against him. but he wanted to get a weapon, and he unfortunately maybe fortunately tried to get this weapon from an FBI guy, and thinking it was Aryan nations. But he was completely convinced that he was on a mission for God. And, it's so fascinating to watch him as he went through this process, because when he went to his first KKK meeting, he said, all these people gathered around me, and I never had this before. Like, I never had family before. And they gathered around him, and he was like, wow, I never felt this before. And he's talking about the sense of belonging and, significance. And then when they introduced him to Christian identity, which is a theology that teaches that Jews are the spawn of Satan, he just bought it hook, line, and sinker. And then he became convinced that if he went and shot up a synagogue, he would be a hero for God.
Wow. Hearing that like shocks me. This side, I am a non-denominational Christian, and to hear someone, identify in those terms is like, wow, that's a very radical departure from like my understanding or interpretation. But it's so interesting to think about the power of that sense of belonging and the pull that it has, and that unmet need maybe has.
And also, you probably know, if your Christianity is important to you, and somebody opens up a Bible and starts reading verses to you and says, do you see how the Jews are the spawn of Satan? And that's what they do. I mean, they cherry verses out of the Bible. And I've heard this from more than one person, and it's not just KKK. KKK tends to follow Christian identity, but many of these do. And they take the sacredness of Christianity, and ISIS did the same thing. They took the sacredness of Islam and they said, look, this is what Islam says, which is complete and total bullshit. But, they just make it up. And they don't totally make it up, because the best lie has truth in it, right? So they pick the verses and then they string them together in a way that tells a totally different story. And think of yourself as a Christian. If somebody took your Christianity and twisted it, you'd be like, well, my Christianity is the core of my identity. I have to accept this. And that's what happens to Muslims that go to ISIS, and that's what happens to Christians that go to Christian identity white supremacism.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Kyle.
Sorry, real quick. So in the Islamic world, when you're talking about jihadists and stuff, there's a political component too, right? I think, I don't know a lot about the politics and the life over there, but I imagine when you join a group and someone sort of winds you up and directs you and aims you toward violence, there's an end of some kind that you're achieving, right? And it may be more of a tangible end. I feel like that's different than when you see people over here who, like the Christchurch shooting or the Pittsburgh
it's the
shooting.
same thing. It's the same thing. I mean, this Benji McDowell that was going to shoot up a synagogue was going to do it because he wanted to emulate Dylan Roof, who had shot up I think it was the Baptist church. I don't remember what kind of Christian church it was, but it was a black church. And both of them wanted to set off a racial war, because people that adhere to these ideologies believe that the races will ultimately enter into warfare and the white race will come out supreme, and they'll hang all the race traitors and all of the liberals and everybody that race mixed, and the whites will be victorious. So that's political. And same thing with ISIS. Come to Syria, we're building a caliphate, and we're going to destroy Assad, who, everybody in the world, except for the Russians maybe, agrees is a horrible person. That, if you look at Assad's atrocities, they're way worse than ISIS. And so ISIS was saying, we're going to defeat Assad and we're going to build up this caliphate, and it will be ruled according to Islamic principles. well, if you're a believing Muslim, you think, oh, yes, please rule by Islam, not by this corrupt, horrible, despotic, tortuous regime.
Right. So the hope was that you would actually get a better way of living, and a way that, because you're convinced that this is a way of righteousness, now it feels really good, because there seems to be a draw within human beings to a type of, could we say, like almost like self-righteous indignation, finding a cause to feel really righteous in holding an extreme stance. Like, this is because now I'm 100% convinced this is right. It feels, you're talking about the inner narcissist, like it feels very satisfying to hold this position, to hold almost like a sense of power and be justified in holding that sense of power. I don't know if I'm off the mark here.
No, I think that's true. And I think it also meets your own needs. You know, that a quest for justice is a good thing. You know, don't we all want a just world?
So then the the KKK, for example, I hear this, and I think it probably had its heyday, I don't know, 150 or 200 years ago or something like that. But the fact that it even still exists today, is it more prevalent than the average person might actually realize? But it's like running more underground or under the surface, or like, does it exist in sort of the capacity that people think it does, or is it maybe more significant than people realize?
Well, I think the ADL, or the Southern Poverty Law Center, said that it was losing some traction. And I think we're finding these other groups like Oath Keepers, certainly Proud Boys.
3%ers.
Yeah, there's a lot of groups that are up and coming. And I don't think it matters. I think,
Right.
whatever group you're part of. But we haven't made any interviews of Oath Keepers yet, and I would really like to. And one of my research colleagues sent to me some texts that he was really concerned about before January 6th, where former military were texting each other saying, we may be called upon to save democracy, and we have to be ready. And, these are special forces guys thinking we have to go and take over because it's a stolen election and the president is calling the real military. And, so if you're thinking about conspiracy theories, QAnon was playing to that. And Oath Keepers was definitely a part of that. And that makes me so sad in a way, because I think Trump will never go to prison. But these people that were sending around texts, and some of them deciding to go to the Capitol and take part, erect gallows and things like that, they just got totally sucked into a mindset that there was going to be a reckoning, that there has been sexual predation. And there certainly has been. I mean, Epstein is not a fiction. He's real. And we've had other sexual predators that are real, that were associated with government and high-level people. So, that's very sick and needs to be stopped. But it's not what QAnon was claiming it was. It just was, sick people.
So they were drastically distorting actual, like, reality to meet a certain political aim.
Exactly. And to keep certain people in power. And, if you think of a special forces guy who spent his whole life serving this country, that was trained to serve this country, to, that has given a military oath, to get confused of, if my president is calling upon me in a non-military sense to come and serve him because the military is the deep state.
Yeah.
How scary is that?
Yeah, they were pretty serious. Ashley Babbitt, the poor woman who was shot and killed in the in the rotunda or wherever it was. She was ex-military. There was a lot of ex-military people there that, for whatever reason, I mean, I'm not qualified to prescribe why it happened. Obviously, maybe you would more than me, but they really thought that they were doing a service of some kind. They'd gotten so spun up on some of these conspiracies and
I
stuff.
think they truly believed that the election was stolen.
Yeah.
And that Trump might need to call former military to come and defend the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, you say that there's like a thread of truth woven into every line. I'm quite sure that electoral politics from the beginning of time have been rife with some form of fraud and corruption. So I think we can't. It's probably safe to say that, like, well, what they can do is they can go, well, see, there was this corruption over here, or this was corruption over here, and they're shining light on, like, they're cherry picking data, I guess, in a sense, because I guess I'm cynical, right? I just assume that, like, every election has an element of corruption and fraud to some degree.
But also, if you're looking for it, you'll find it too. If you have a very high level narrative, it's the paradigm, the adage, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you believe that there's this, if you believe in this sort of QAnon, especially, that had this overarching narrative to it, you'll just find things that, especially a narrative that's not really well spelled out. It was sort of crowdsourced in a way, and it's just mostly just fed people's angst, and so you start seeing stuff. You start seeing nails wherever you look for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And would you describe it as people, like, looking for a sense of control when they feel like sort of maybe their life is spinning out of control, and this gives them something to, some sense of meaning or purpose, and maybe a little bit of feeling like they have some control and power?
I think that's true. I think that, I think a lot of people, I mean, we were told by a number of leaders of white supremacist groups that they were very successful at recruiting military, because military guys that get out are lost, and they want to join an organization that has ranks and structure. They want to feel important. If they get asked to train others, in tactical and weapons training, it's a skill they have, and they're appreciated for it. I mean, if you come back to Iraq and you're unemployed, I mean, that sucks, right? And, then if this white supremacist group says, well, you're really important and we need you, and eventually we're going to, create a more just system, but we need you to be part of it, that's going to speak to you.
And would there be, there's sort of a second question that's lurking in my mind, just with regards to those who have redemptive qualities and those who may not. But if we look at this element of, let's say they're recruiting someone who's maybe doesn't have a job and has a military background, are some of these higher level individuals in these organizations, like, successful in maybe in positions where they could, hey, we'll get you a job in this organization and things like that, like other ways to make it feel as though we're taking care of you? Does stuff like that take place?
Definitely. I talked to one woman. I mean, some of these people are not stupid at all. I mean, there are people that are like this guy that was going to do the synagogue shooting. I don't know if the right word for him is stupid as much as traumatized, so traumatized in his youth that he was developmentally delayed. I think if you get enough trauma, you don't think well, and you're constantly interrupted in your thought processes. But then there's these other people that are just, really super smart, but they don't fit in anywhere, or they got bullied, or they're just lost people. And I talked to one that was telling me, I personally couldn't get into the military, but we were all encouraged to join up to the military so that we would get weapons training, so that we would get equipped. And some of us got in, and those of us that didn't get in got hired into military contracts by, people that knew who we were and helped us to get into those positions. And, we had an agenda.
So you've talked to some some people who've probably not only held pretty extreme views, but potentially carried out some pretty extreme acts as well. But you're looking at it through a lens of compassion. So one without necessarily judgment, but one where you're seeking to understand. And what we might, as a snap emotional judgment, say that this human being is a monster. Do you see some redemptive qualities in some of these individuals when you speak with them?
I tend to think, I mean, I don't know, I guess I look at it as, if you start to think about it in those terms, I think about what the Bible tells us about a hardened heart, and that, some people can have such a hardened heart that you can't reach them. They're just, and, like a psychopath. And if you think about psychopaths, almost all of them had really crappy childhoods. And I think that they learned to be manipulators. They learned the only reason I should read your feelings is to get whatever I need, and I should be empathetic when it serves me. But otherwise, I don't have empathy like a normal person would. I might be able to look like I care about you, but I don't. I only care about what can I get and how can it serve me. And those kind of people are really scary. But most of the people I talk to are not all the way to that level. They're more needy people that fell into something that they thought would meet their needs. And once they fell into it, it's hard to get out because they don't have anything else meeting their needs. And what I found is that some of the people in our sample went to psychologists, and the psychologists were afraid to treat them. They were scared of them. And I think, okay, if I always did a therapy practice in my home, and if somebody came with swastika tattoos and, scary things and sat down and said, I was part of blah, 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 and this is what I did, honestly, I would hang in there with them. But I can see somebody getting scared and thinking, I don't know if I want to treat you. But then the other side of it is, we all get these patients that need way more than an hour a week, or way more than 2 hours a week. And that's not the way psychology is set up. Psychology is like, really boundaried, and which is a good thing. But these people need social work and community programs and all kinds of things that help them to exit their groups. Because if your whole group, your whole life is structured around a hate group, that's where you're making your money, that's what you're married into, that's what all your friendships are. And then you're going to exit by having 1 hour a week with a psychologist? I don't think so.
Yeah,
you're going to need a lot more than that. So we have to give credit to all these formers. Like, we have a former on our staff. His name is T.M. Garrett. He's amazing. And, he'll do things like he let a former come and live with him for 2 weeks, and just helps these people. And he says, they have horrible things like, their parole officer is after them. They're going to go back to prison. Or, they're completely unemployed and they can't get a job because they have tattooed across their face, swastikas. And they need a tattoo artist to help them cover up their tattoos before they can get a job. And, they need a lot of intensive care. And the only people that seems to be doing that intensive care are formers.
Yeah, it makes sense that it makes sense that if they were to have gotten into these situations because it was filling some kind of a void in their life, if they get out of those situations, that void may still be there, may reoccur, and it's hard to. They've got to fill it with something else, and I think the system's not really set up to help them fill that. Like you say, an hour a week's nothing compared to a full life that they'd filled with this other group, because that was the void they were feeling. The void is that large, right?
Right. And imagine, like Jeff Shoup was telling me, he runs Beyond Barriers. He used to be the head of the National Socialist Movement. And he said, we got a call from a woman that she's got like 4 or 5 kids. And she said, my husband won't leave. And I don't know how to get out. I'm afraid I'll lose my kids. I'm afraid I'll lose everything. The guy's making the income, and, what do they do?
Yeah. Hey, question for you. I probably should have asked this at the beginning, but how are you talking to these people? I picture you talking to them in jail, but I suppose they're not all in prison.
No, they're not in prison.
Yeah.
Almost
How
all of
are
them
you connecting with them?
word of mouth. So TM helped me find a lot of them. Some of them we found over the internet. Some of them we found because one subject referred another subject. And no, they're not in prison because they haven't been. I mean, some of them admitted to crimes. I always tell them our research ethic is please don't incriminate yourself. But some of them tell us of horrible things they did.
Yeah.
And I always try to stop them from telling me too much about that because I don't want them to end up in trouble because of the research interview. And but no, they're not in prison. Some of them have been in prison in the past. And the ones that were in prison, it sounds pretty grim, that there's groups that protect each other in prison, and white supremacist groups are one of the groups you can join in prison.
So on some level they want to be they're I guess so I actually heard you on the Trust Me podcast, and I thought you were very interesting there. I love that podcast. But what I was picturing when I was listening to you there is seeing them as sort of not a captive audience necessarily, but just sort of like in the classic, you'd see it in a movie of people sitting across the table from each other in a prison room or something. But these people, they on some level they're willing participants in the sense that they're seeking you out or have been referred in some way. It's actually it's amazing how many people you've spoken to, considering they're an active participant in this, I guess. So that it seems like there's a big appetite maybe for them to be heard.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I mean, when TM approaches them, because he's approached a lot of them, and Jeff Shoup also helped us. I think they kind of introduced me as she's a psychologist. She's, she doesn't bite, and she's trying to understand this phenomena. Would you be willing to talk to her? And there's always this first 5 minutes of getting on Zoom and, here I am, and, are you going to talk to me or not? And I asked myself this a long time ago because I was making interviews in West Bank and Gaza of terrorists, basically. And my students couldn't believe that I could get people to talk. And I started asking myself, I was asking myself, what is that gift? And back then I said, it's because I traveled with students and I fit their cultural stereotype. I'm the mother with my two, adoring students and their boys. And, like I love them too, like a mother. And they see that and they resonate to that. I think, maybe. And then later I thought it's microfacial. Like they look at your face and they figure out, are you lying or are you trustworthy? Mm-hmm. And at this point, I really believe it's energy. I think people read each other's energy signatures, and I am genuine, and I really, truly care about people. And I think they feel it. And I think they see in the first 5 minutes of talking to me, she's safe. I can trust her.
Which is really fascinating. And so you mentioned, because one of your books that I would like to read, I haven't got it in my collection just yet, but it's Talking to Terrorists. And I believe that one on the cover of that book is a picture of a 4-year-old pointing a pistol at you. And also somewhere along the way in that experience, you also spent a night in the home of a terrorist as well.
Here it is.
Yeah, wow, that's like quite a thick volume there.
Yeah, it is. My husband always said he'd give a prize to anybody that reads it. Um, but I have heard some people that read it cover to cover, and it's easy read. It's just stories, and that little girl. I was in, I think it was Nablus, and I was talking to people that were in a safe house where 2 suicide bombers had just come before they went to do their suicide mission, and the woman, her mother, was kind of horrible that she was, getting people ready for suicide missions. But the little girl was scared that we were Israelis. So she went and got a toy pistol and brought it out and aimed it at me. And I didn't know if it was a real gun or not. And I was like, what's going on? And they said, don't worry, it's not a real gun. And I said, can I take your picture? And I did. But then the second picture is the one on the cover, which is here. And as you can see on the cover, she's holding the gun correctly, right? And a Palestinian adult showed her how to hold the pistol. And, I was just witnessing this thinking, this is what makes a terrorist, that they're afraid, that they think there's an enemy, that an adult shows them how to defend, like you should use a gun and this is how you use it. And, how horrible, right? And, this beautiful little child. And, I had one counterterrorism expert criticize me for putting that child on the cover of my book, but I put her because my central thesis was no one is born a terrorist. And terrorists are made. And here is a perfect example of a little child being made into a terrorist.
Was there any situation that you found yourself in where you felt like genuinely threatened or unsafe because of the work that you were doing?
Definitely. When I went in Gaza, I was living in Belgium, and I had people from Gaza in Brussels that introduced me to Hamas members in Gaza. So when I got to Gaza City, I called them up and they said, drop your interpreter. We'll give you an interpreter and we'll come and pick you up. And I agreed to do it. And when I got to this safe house, I was surrounded by, 16 or 17 pretty serious Hamas guys with pistols on their, strapped around them. And we had a meal together, and I remember them eating the chicken, and I was the only woman in the room, and my student was with me, and they said, why are you wearing a headscarf? Because my interpreter had convinced me to wear a headscarf while I was in Gaza. And I said, out of respect for you, because I was told by my interpreter that I'd be the only woman not wearing a headscarf in Gaza, and I wanted to make it easy for you to talk to me, but I'm Christian. And they said, oh, okay, that's good. And, while this chicken fat's dripping down their beards, and then they keep eating and they go, have you thought that we picked you up and you're at the safe house and nobody knows where you are and we can keep you if we want. We can keep you hostage.
What?
And I said, you could. I had to think fast. And I said,
right.
But I don't believe that you would ever violate Arab hospitality. And your relatives back in Belgium set this up. And I don't believe that you would violate your ethic of hospitality. And they looked at each other and they're like, good answer. And I thought, okay. Whew. And we ended up getting a really good interview, but thank God I got back, And although Hamas doesn't have any real history of taking people, Americans, hostage, there have been Westerners that were taken hostage in Gaza, but it wasn't Hamas. And then also in the West Bank, I had a similar situation. I was with the PFLP, and I had interviewed Ahmed Sadat a couple of times in the Jericho prison, and I was with all his cohort at a house, and we were eating a meal together. I went to the restroom. When I came back, my student said, they called me Specky. Specky, did you know they want to keep you hostage? And I laughed and I said, okay, good. Well, then I'll continue my research. That'll give me a lot of time to interview all of you. And he said, they're not joking, Specky. And I looked at him and I said, no, you don't want me as hostage. And they said, well, if we took you as hostage, we could break out Ahmed Sadat from prison. And I don't know. I just had a brainstorm really fast. And I said, no. I'm a woman. And, there's no equality between me and Ahmed Sadat, who was their venerated leader. And they're very sexist. And with Israelis, it would be a bloodbath. And I said, no, that will never work. And then they were like, yeah, crappy hostage. No, we won't do
Amazing.
it. Wow. And I mean, I guess when you go into a situation like this, in one sense, do you kind of mentally prepare yourself for this is a possibility that I shouldn't entirely ignore or brush aside?
Always, I think when I go in a conflict zone, you can be killed. And I don't know, at some point, I have a friend that's a time researcher. He's Ukrainian. And he says the more intense experiences you had in your life, the more you feel that you lived a full life, like you can kind of let go of it. Like you feel like you lived a much longer life than maybe somebody else. And I already do feel that. I feel like if I die, okay, I did a lot. I traveled here, I traveled there, I interviewed all these 800 terrorists, and I'm okay dying. I really am. And I'm religious, so I believe in an afterlife, but I'm not okay being a hostage. And so I always think about, what are the chances of dying? What are the chances of being in an IED and having your legs blown off, or you're, being blinded or some serious handicap? And what are the chances of being taken hostage? And so I was going into Syria, into the Kurdish SDF territory, pretty much every 3 months for 2 years. And that was always pretty dicey. And I thought about it a lot. And I, decided that I trusted the SDF to protect me. And, but I remember once they asked us, do you want to go to Raqqa? And I decided that, yeah, I did want to see Raqqa. And when we were in Raqqa, this woman totally in a black niqab came up to me, and she saw a Western woman and she wanted to talk to me. And I don't know, just this kind of person. I put my arm around her. And I thought later, if she had a knife, she could have just stabbed me so easily. But I put my arm around her and said, somebody take a picture. And she was truly a grateful person. Like, I'm glad this is all over. And not hateful at all. But if she was a hater, I would be dead now.
That's quite something to think about. But I can appreciate just the idea that you've lived a full life, and you've accomplished some really remarkable things as a result of that, which is amazing. I want to say that I really appreciate it. It's unfortunate that we missed a little bit of the beginning. Kyle and I had a pretty good conversation to fill in the gap, but I'm really, really grateful.
Sorry.
That's so okay. That you still made the time for to join us in this conversation. It's been really, really fascinating and a real pleasure. And Kyle was one who alerted me to, said, I heard this lady speak in this podcast. I was like, I'm just going to reach out and ask. We're still a relatively small podcast and just getting started, but I have a real fascination for trying to understand how people think and the way they do, because I work in the realm of sort of behavioral psychology and nutrition science. So I work with sort of eating disorders, and but I have a fascination for people's stories, and again, trying to understand how they get to where they get to.
Well, eating disorders so often are, caught up in their parents' marriage, or wanting to control things, wanting to be perfect. So sad. And yeah, well, you sound like you have a really compassionate heart as well.
Well,
and
thank you.
That's what's needed, and healers are needed. People that can, free people from their oppression, and the more that we can heal people and turn them towards true solutions instead of these false solutions that extremists are offering to them.
Well, I do say that like compassion and integrity are my two core values, the central core values that I try to live by, the lens that I try to view the world. So just give you a very, very brief backstory in a nutshell. I don't want to hijack the story, but 11 years ago, I was nearly murdered. I was nearly beaten to death. And it was a really traumatic experience to go through. And I fell into binge eating and food addiction as a result of that trauma and became morbidly obese. And I didn't know how to find my way out of it because nothing in life really prepares us to go through sort of a violent, intense experience like that. And there was a few more incidents that happened that sort of layered on top of it. I was living in South Africa at the time. And so it was kind of a long road out of that. And maybe it was me trying to learn and understand and solve my own problems that led me to doing the work that I do now. It feels like I don't know, I'm able to sort of look at people and get a sense of their humanity, even in like what would be really difficult experiences. And that's kind of why I actually wanted to start this podcast. I said, I would really be fascinated to interview someone like a white supremacist. So when I came across your name, that you've already done a lot of the heavy lifting, well, I could short circuit that a little bit and ask you instead. So
that's awesome, and I think that's so normal that when we've been through horrible pain, we look for whatever can help us self-medicate, and it's so beautiful that you can reach down to your pain and then feel other people's pain and say, I recognize that, I get that. And when they hear that you know their pain, it gives them the opportunity to open up because then they trust you. And a lot of people aren't comfortable hearing other people's pain because they're not comfortable with their own pain. And we're all carrying a bucket load of pain around. I mean, some a lot more than others. I mean, not many of us have been almost beaten to death, and God bless you that you survived it. But it sounds like you've turned it to good.
Yeah, well, I actually say it's an experience I wouldn't remove from my past because I wouldn't be where I am doing what I do had I not gone through that. So I end up being really quite grateful for it. Although so I wouldn't pick that experience. I wouldn't put my hand up for it.
No, you wouldn't choose it, but it chose you, and you used it for good. And God bless you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and really, thank you again for making the time for being a part of this conversation. It's been very special.
Anytime.
And if this is always sort of a tough one, but I think to myself, if you could maybe condense some of your work into just maybe a nugget of actionable wisdom that people could take away from like what you've learned, just one small thing, what would you share with people to help them maybe move forward to a more kind and compassionate way of being?
Well, I would say, well, there's a couple things. So if you're dealing with anybody in white supremacism or domestic violence, gangs, anything, so many of them have told me it's a really common encounter, oftentimes with someone from a minority group who was kind to them, and it totally blew their minds. And so to know that you have the power to blow somebody else's mind, that just an act of kindness, a smile, even though you see a swastika tattooed on their skin, and you're Jewish or minority or whatever, and you're still willing to be kind and loving to them. And in general, I would say the power of love. I mean, we should never underestimate the power of love. Every single one of us needs to be loved. So anytime you can extend love to other people, and the truth is you can always extend love to other people. And there's no limit to love. And, it's just this incredibly powerful force that heals people and helps them to transform themselves.
That's amazing. And then just lastly, if people want to learn more about your work and what it is that you do, and I know you've authored now a number of books. I'm not sure quite how many. Is it 4 or 6 maybe? Where may people find these? Because I know that Talking to Terrorists is already moving to the high up on my list of books I want to read. So
okay, well, it's a great big fat one. You just saw that. I've gotta put that on Audible so you can listen instead of read it. But it is an easy read. But yeah, I've written 5 books, and one of them is fictionalized account of a ISIS woman, but the rest of them are nonfiction. But they're all easy to read because they're just stories. And you can also go to our website of the center that I direct, which is the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, which has the initials ICSVE and .org. And then we have all kinds of research reports. And our ethic at our center is to give everything away for free. You can also go to our YouTube channel for ICSVE, that's International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism. And there you can see over 250 counter-narrative videos. They're ISIS people where we made a 2-hour interview, and then we asked their permission, can we cut this into something short that's a counter-narrative? And we strung together where they told what their grievance was, what their experience in the terrorist group was, and how disappointed they were with the terrorist group and how they would advise against joining it. We did the same thing. We call that breaking the ISIS brand and breaking al-Shabaab. And then we did the same thing with white supremacists. So there's 50 interviews of white supremacists, 250 of ISIS. I think there's 10 of al-Shabaab, and they're all on our YouTube channel for ICSVE. So you can go and binge watch if you want. And anyway, so you can read, you can watch. We don't have a lot in audio. We should, but we don't.
Yeah, I'll probably go and binge watch a few of them because it's right up my alley in terms of trying to understand human behavior. Kyle, is there any last thing that you wanted to ask before we wind up?
No, thanks a lot for talking to us. I think your story is extremely interesting. So I definitely will be looking out for your books as well.
You're welcome. And your story is interesting too. And thank you for your podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning into It's Not So Black and White. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, or leave a review because that helps this podcast to reach more people. It's fascinating to explore the thoughts and minds of those who see the world differently. We don't have to agree on everything in order to engage in civil discourse. So I hope this podcast inspires you to have an open mind and a willingness to see things from another perspective. In this, we can create a hopeful future moving forward.
Whatever your belief system, go and investigate it. Like really dig down into it. And you can only benefit from really thinking deeply about why you believe something.